Day 2, January 12, 1848. Unpopular voice, Washington, D.C. Lincoln, almost 39 years old, has finally achieved a goal he has had for a long time. After some unsuccessful attempts, his district in Illinois has elected him to the U.S. House of Representatives. Most politicians in that position play it safe. New members of Congress are told to act like children, be seen but not heard. And Lincoln, having waited so long for his chance to play a role in national affairs, has every reason to be cautious, polite, and politically correct. Instead, today Lincoln will launch a political attack on the party that controls Congress and on the President of the United States, James K. Polk. In the photo, Lincoln in his late 30s. It's believed this photo was taken in 1846 or 1847, although Lincoln's oldest son, Robert, thought it might have been taken a year or so later when Lincoln was serving in Congress. The Illinois voters who sent him to Washington, many of whom knew him from his 4 previous terms as a state legislator, will be surprised. He's not known as a firebrand. He's seen as a good-natured and more likely to make his point with a funny story than a long speech. He still displays the social graces of a frontier American, which pleases his supporters. His intellect and judgment are well regarded, but he's modest about them. During his terms in the Illinois legislature, he focused on dull but important improvements to the state's roads and waterways. But unlike many good-natured politicians who appear confident and powerful yet constantly worry about losing anyone's goodwill, Lincoln isn't afraid to take a stand against popular opinion. While he was a state legislator, someone called for a vote supporting the right of property in slaves. Because Illinois was a northern, free state, it was just a symbolic vote favoring the policies of slavery, not a vote for a law. Voting aye, which was how most of the public felt, would have cost Lincoln nothing. In fact, of the 82 other legislators voting on the bill, only 5 were voting against it. But Lincoln joined the tiny group making a stand against the bill, going on record with his unpopular belief that the institution of slavery is founded on both injustice and bad policy. This is the Lincoln who is about to take a stand in Congress. The war path. The issue for him today isn't slavery, it's war. For the past 2 years, the United States has been fighting Mexico because Mexico owns the land that the United States wants. A few years earlier, in 1845, the United States announced it was taking over the Mexican territory of Texas. Around the same time, it told Mexico it wanted to buy the territories of California and New Mexico. But Mexico said it wanted Texas back and that it wasn't interested in selling the other land. That's when the United States decided to take the land by force, claiming that Mexico had attacked Americans in Texas, a claim that historians consider questionable. The federal government, driven by President Polk, roused the country with slogans about liberty and justice for the people of the West. Congress asked for 50,000 volunteers, 300,000 signed up. From the declaration of war in May of 1846 to the capture of Mexico City in September of 1847, the war was easygoing for the United States. In the photo, James K. Polk, 1795 to 1849, the 11th President of the United States, son of a wealthy farmer and a distinguished student at the University of North Carolina, he was a member of Congress by age 30, then Speaker of the House of Representatives, and then the Governor of Tennessee before becoming President. Although his critics, including Lincoln, disliked his tactics for expanding the borders of the U.S. within his own party, he was considered a moderate because he didn't want to take all of Mexico. It secured everything it wanted. Military commanders became national heroes. When Lincoln arrived in Washington as a new member of Congress, all that remained was negotiation of the final peace treaty. Incredibly, Lincoln is going to make a principled protest against the war. The past 2 years have proved that the war critics are shouted down and called unpatriotic. Even the colleagues who agree with him believe he's making a mistake by speaking publicly about the subject. But for Lincoln, the issue is too important to ignore. Ulysses S. Grant, the future general and U.S. president, was a young officer in Mexico and was angry about the war until the end of his life. To this day, he said shortly before dying, I regard the war as one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation. It was an instance of a republic following the bad example of European monarchies in not considering justice and the desire to acquire additional territory. War critics had another crucial objection. As Grant put it, the occupation, separation, and annexation of Texas were far from the inception of the movement to its final consummation, a conspiracy to acquire territory out of which slave states might be formed for the American Union. Although extending slavery would have broken several agreements made between the states, one of which, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, was older than the Constitution, the slave states didn't care. A congressman from Pennsylvania, David Wilmot, tried to prevent this extension of slavery by making Congress agree even before the war ended that slavery would not be permitted in any territory gained during the conflict. Congress rejected this Wilmot proviso many times. President Polk, of course, consistently told the public that taking the territory had never been the goal of the United States. He completely avoided the question of slavery. Lincoln was infuriated by Polk's dishonesty in explaining the reasons for and the goals of the war. A few days before this day's confrontation, Lincoln demanded evidence from Polk for the president's claim that Mexico was the aggressor. On this day, he'll be even stronger in his attack. Miserably perplexed. Washington, D.C. has 40,000 residents, an astonishing number to a Westerner like Lincoln. But the city still has only 2 paved streets, and the backyards of even downtown houses are likely to be filled with farm animals. Heading to the state capitol building, which doesn't even have its distinctive dome, Lincoln passes pigs that have been let out to be fed on the street litter. He's fired up by the time he rises to make his speech. The careful, moderate words for which he'll eventually become famous are set aside today. He says the president's reason for going to war was the sheerest deception. Under the picture, a political cartoon from 1848 makes fun of Senator Lewis Cass, a nominee for president who wanted to continue the expansionist policies of President Polk. He's saying, New Mexico, California, Chihuahua, Zacatecas, Mexico, Peru, Yucatan, Cuba. The first 2 being territories just won in the war with Mexico, the others being what he'd supposedly take next. The bloody sword over his head, labeled Manifest Destiny, refers to the idea that European Americans had an obvious, manifest, fate, destiny, to expand westward across the continent. Cass lost the election. Polk's latest explanations, Lincoln says, are like half the insane mumbling of a fever dream. The president's ever-changing plans to finish what was started, says Lincoln, are equally wandering and indefinite. Usually for Lincoln, it's a strong personal attack. Polk, Lincoln says, knows not where he is. He is bewildered, confounded, and miserably perplexed man. Much of what Lincoln says is true, but that hardly matters. The label of unpatriotic is easily stuck to war protesters, even when they're right. Few voters will stop to think that Lincoln was actually being more patriotic than they were. Another Illinois politician at the time refused to voice his opinions against the Mexican American with a sarcastic comment about the public's love of war. I opposed the War of 1812. That's enough for me. I am now perpetually in favor of the war, pestilence, and famine. Although Lincoln's term in Congress is only just the beginning, he has already made enemies and disappointed voters back in Illinois. When his term is over, his party will lose his seat, and Lincoln's criticism of the war will be blamed with good reason. In the end, the United States will pay Mexico for much of the land it has taken, which will make the critics happy, but the question of slavery in the new territories won't be resolved. The conflict in the West will soon turn deadly, foreshadowing the Civil War. When it does, Lincoln will be there. Gold was discovered in the newly won territory of California less than a month before the signing of the treaty ending the Mexican-American War. The gold rush began about a year later, and in time, Americans outnumbered the Mexican citizens of the state. The poster above advertises the quickest, safest, and cheapest passage in the days before the railroad. 2 steamship rides connected by an overland passage in Central America, where the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans are separated by only a couple hundreds of miles. The company advertising in this poster has a route through Nicaragua. Panama was a more popular choice.